Well, welcome to the 700 Club. President Trump ordered a military strike on Iran last night and then reversed course before any missiles were fired.
This comes as tensions are rising between the United States and the Iranian regime, and one day after a U.S. surveillance drone was shot down in the Persian Gulf. Mark Martin has the story.
With planes in the air and ships in position, President Trump called off the strike targeting radar and missile sites. It's not clear if the president stopped the attacks because he changed his mind or due to logistical and strategic reasons. All this in response to Iran's downing of a U.S. surveillance drone.
They made a very big mistake.
Iranian officials say the drone, similar to this one, was hovering in their airspace when they used surface-to-air missiles to shoot it down. But during a Pentagon briefing, the head of the U.S. Air Force Central Command said that's not true.
This was an unprovoked attack on a U.S. surveillance asset that had not violated Iranian airspace at any time during its mission. This attack is an attempt to disrupt our ability to monitor the area following recent threats to international shipping and the free flow of commerce.
Iran's ambassador to the UN tells NPR it tried to contact the drone, but, quote, since it was a spy drone, we were left with no other option. U.S. military leaders say the drone was over the Strait of Hormuz in international airspace. The shootdown follows a string of incidents in recent weeks, including attacks on 6 commercial ships in the region, Iran suspected in all of them. Word that Iranian proxies were loading missiles onto boats within range of U.S. naval assets and other threats, all in response to U.S.-led sanctions against Iran after the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Lawmakers are split on what the next move should be. Some urge caution, others just the opposite.
We're worried that he and the administration may bumble into a war.
The only way Iran changes its behavior is if they believe America will put options on the table that would create pain for the regime.
Iran did claim responsibility for shooting down the U.S. drone. The head of the Revolutionary Guard saying the Islamic regime doesn't want armed conflict, but it's ready for war. Meanwhile, the FAA has stopped U.S. commercial air traffic from flying over Iran because of safety concerns. That affects flights over the Persian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. The ban is in effect until further notice. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Well, President Trump has said what he wants is talks, and talks to go back again to the negotiating table to determine what's the future of Iran's nuclear weapons program. But the supreme leader, and it's, the Revolutionary Guard says all decisions are up to him. He's already said he's never going to negotiate with Trump. So here we are in a situation where a trigger was pulled and then pulled back. One thing I know, in the Middle East, you never show weakness. And so if you're going to strike, if you're going to make that decision, then if you don't go through with it, what's the interpretation on the other side? We've seen a series of provocations. These bombings of tankers are in direct violation of international law, international trade. Then you shoot down a drone in international airspace, and if there's no retaliation, what's the Iranian regime going to say? Well, we can do this, and we can do this with impunity. Are there steps that you can do before you get into military conflict? Yes, but when you look at what Israel did when Iran shot a missile at one of their jets, what they did is they went back and bombed that missile site. Can we get into some kind of increased boycott? Can you get into a blockade of their ports, stop all of their oil shipments? Can you make their airspace a no-fly zone and cut off all commercial traffic? All of those things can happen, but we're just going to have to stand by and see. This is a hot point right now. And could we stumble into war? The answer is absolutely yes. And what would happen if we do? Specifically, what could happen to the nation of Israel? The standoff between the U.S. and Iran could have an impact on Israel, and Efrem Graham has that story from our CBN newsroom.
Gordon, with the talk of possible U.S. military action against Iran, there are concerns Israel might be dragged into the conflict. As CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell explains, that's because one of Israel's biggest threats, Hezbollah in Lebanon, gets its money and marching orders from Iran.
Looking at these peaceful hills, it's hard to imagine a well-armed enemy is hidden and possibly waiting to strike.
The fact that Hezbollah is involved in every aspect of life of the people in those towns on the other side of the border enables it to deploy such a huge and massive military infrastructure in South Lebanon.
We're standing on the Israeli-Lebanese border. Just on the other side, you can see the yellow Hezbollah flags flying. The IDF estimates that Hezbollah has hidden well over 100,000 rockets in these towns and villages in southern Lebanon.
All of them comfortably hidden behind Lebanese civilians inside Lebanon.
IDF spokesman Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conriquez says that plays into Hezbollah's hands.
And the aim of Hezbollah is to be able to have those rockets, fire them at Iranian orders at our civilians, and then once we retaliate, that would cause collateral damage, and they would then try to use that for their advantage.
During fighting in 2006, Hezbollah launched some 4,000 rockets at northern Israeli cities. Now, most of Israel is in range of its rockets.
Hezbollah is still more armed than many European armies today.
And it's financed by Iran.
Iranian money has facilitated this, as well as many other hostile, aggressive endeavors that Hezbollah has, whether it is the vast rocket arsenal that Hezbollah has, whether it is trying to convert rockets into accurate missiles, or the tunnel project.
CBN News recently got a rare look inside the 6th and largest tunnel Israel has uncovered along its border with Lebanon. You're looking at the equivalent of a 22-story building underground. Had it not been discovered, hundreds of armed Hezbollah fighters could have filled the tunnel, waiting to attack, kidnap, and kill Israelis. Reserve Lieutenant Colonel Sarit Zahavi says there's always a possibility of war.
I think it depends on how much pressure will be put on Iran and Hezbollah. It depends, like the leader of Hezbollah said, that if there will be war between Iran and United States, Israel and Saudi Arabia will be attacked.
So will there be a war with Hezbollah?
We sure aren't looking for one. But at the end of the day, if the Iranians order Hezbollah to attack Israel, they will be met with a very firm and strong and a painful response by the IDF.
For now, Israel and the rest of the Middle East wait to see whether U.S.-Iranian tensions grow or dissipate. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, on the Israeli-Lebanese border.
Back here at home, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled a memorial cross not far from the nation's capital can stay on public land. CBN's Abby Robertson reports now from Washington.
The Supreme Court issued a big win for religious liberty, ruling 7-2 that the Bladensburg Memorial can stand, a 40-foot cross honoring 49 men from the area lost in World War I.
The Supreme Court has sided with reality and sensibility.
The legal showdown started when the American Humanist Association challenged that the cross, sitting on public land, violated the separation of church and state.
When I heard they wanted to take it down, it struck at my heart. It was terrible.
The memorial is in the shape of a cross to mark most graves of the war's fallen across Europe.
There's going to be a presumptive constitutionality for these religious symbols and monuments and memorials and practices across our country. That's a sea change.
Kelly Shackelford, chief counsel for the First Liberty Institute, says the legal precedent in the case of the cross was flawed.
They said that everything's changing. This 50-year-old precedent, this Lemon case, where separation of church and state, and all these concepts that are not in the words of the Constitution were brought up, and that led to a lot of hostility by the government to religion. They said, and look, in these cases, Lemon is not going to be applied anymore.
At stake in the Peace Cross ruling was this dire scenario.
If this memorial is able to be destroyed, that means that bulldozer is going to turn from Bladensburg and roll across the river over to Arlington National Cemetery, where it'll start knocking down the Argonne Cross, the Canadian Cross of Sacrifice, and may even make its way down to Teddy and Bobby Kennedy's graves, which themselves have grave markers in the shape of a cross.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of 2 justices who dissented, argues when a cross is on public property, the government may be presumed to endorse its religious content.
The founders would be shocked by that idea. We are religious people with a religious heritage. There's a Moses holding the Ten Commandments in the Supreme Court.
First Liberty is also celebrating the High Court throwing out an Oregon court's ruling against their clients who refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. Reporting from the Supreme Court, Abigail Robertson, CBN News.
The memorial is something certainly those men have earned. Gordon?
Well, this is in my opinion, a narrow ruling. And essentially what the court has said is if you have an historical monument, and in this case, a monument that's 100 years old, if there's an historical monument, if the government comes in and then tears it down, then that is hostility from the government against religion and would be interpreted by the population as hostility to the Christian religion. And so that's why they said, no, the monument has to stand. So there's now an exception if there's an historical monument, if it's got a long history behind it, then it gets to stand. But there's still an open question if you were to build a new monument to the fallen in a war, what would happen? Would that be considered an endorsement of religion? Let me underline what Justice Ginsburg did. She took the unusual step, and it is unusual, to read her dissent in the open court. That tells you how much she feels about this. And she, in her dissent, said any cross on public land is an endorsement of religion. And this goes back to the famous Lemon test, Lemon versus Kurtzman. It's back from 1971. That case outlined excessive entanglement, but it has been interpreted by the court subsequently that any endorsement of religion is improper under the First Amendment Establishment Clause. The founders would just turn over in their grave on this interpretation. For them, established religion was state religion, that if you weren't part of the state religion, then you were considered an outsider in society. They, of course, endorsed religion and, of course, endorsed Christianity. In the Constitution, it's written, in the year of our Lord. The Declaration of Independence has an appeal to the sovereign God. They were a very religious people. And for us to now be hostile to religion, to say we can't ever have a cross, is just mind-boggling to me. Now, what's going to happen with a new cross that's built? I'm sitting right now in the city of Virginia Beach. We had a terrible, terrible tragedy with a shooting at Building 2. It was a public building. And in the aftermath of that shooting, crosses were put up by the mourners. And those crosses were put up under their feeling of grief, their feeling of sorrow, their feeling of loss. Under Justice Ginsburg's interpretation of the Constitution, all of that was improper because you can't put a cross on public land. I vigorously disagree.